This is Duke University.
On today's Left of Black, we're joined by Professor Gaye Theresa Johnson, Associate Professor of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She talks about her new book, Spaces of Conflict and Sounds of Solidarity. My name is Anthony Neal, and this is Left of Black.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Gaye Theresa Johnson, Associate Professor of Black Studies with affiliations in the Department of History and Chicano Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we're here today to talk about her new book, her latest book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles, published by the University of California Press. How are you doing today, Gaye Theresa?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. And it is such a pleasure to be on the show. I am such a fan of the show and of the work that you all are doing there with this show. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. First off, for me, this might be the best book I've read about race in Los Angeles since Mike Davis's City of Quartz or R.J. Smith's The Great Black Way. You have a real kind of feel for the landscape, which makes me think that you might have grew up in this landscape.
Well, it's interesting because I live not that far from Los Angeles, but I haven't spent a lot of time living there. I've spent a lot of time entrenched in the politics there. I do a lot of work in LA now. In fact, I'm very much involved with the Los Angeles Community Action Network. I've incorporated a lot of what they do into my teaching. So tried to maintain a steady in South LA. So I'm there a lot, but I did have some time as a child growing up in LA, yes.
One of the terms that comes out, and it's in the book title, but it's really an amazing kind of theoretical intervention, this idea of spatial entitlement. Can you talk a little bit about that concept?
Sure, absolutely. Spatial entitlement is something that came to me I think maybe rather late in the writing. I mean, as I looked back over what I was seeing in the examples that I found historically and in terms of the social justice models that are generated by the interactions that I study, I started to think about how the popular cultural forms that I think have been deployed as such an incredible weapon and in such creative ways, not just to combat some of the terrible issues that have faced these communities, but also as a way to reinstate one's humanity, both personally and collectively. I started to think about how much these popular cultural forms were about space, about taking up space, but also about articulating one's right to be seen in space on the landscape of a terrain that has been so contested, but more than anything, where most of our history as Black and Brown people have been written out of anything that has to do with a meaningful future. And so when I think about the ways that Black and Brown people have had to, in many ways, creatively, in ingenious ways, find a way to say, look, not only do I have a history here that's meaningful, but we're going to be here and we plan to be here in the future. So no matter what kind of spaces you eradicate for us, no matter which way that you say that what we utter, what we sing, how we dance is dangerous or not meaningful or somehow not built into the fabric of what Los Angeles and by extension the entire United States is about. And no matter how much you try to convince us that we have no connection to other aggrieved populations across the world, we see these connections. And we've decided that even if we are not entitled anymore through whatever kind of public policy to buying property, et cetera, we will regain our dignity in some mode through space. And it's fascinating how people have done that. And this is why I feel like I was so blessed to come across the unexpected things in the book, such as my realization that I had to look at punk music, which is not in any way what I ever thought I would have been listening to. But I thought, here's a place where actually space functions in a completely different way than I had intended to talk about in the book. Whereas in other chapters, I'm talking about how people take up space, sonic space, physical space. Here, I'm talking about how people identify the spaces around them as places that are meaningful, even when other people have said they mean nothing, we've thrown them away. Turning something like your grandmother's backyard into a meaningful space of congregation is something that I think is overlooked too much, not just in our history as Black and brown people, but also as something that we do today in this world that continuously is being kind of shoved down our throats as something with no borders and no meaningful places that we can call our own, and yet it's so clear the ones that we're shut out of and not welcome in.
You know, one of the things that's really interesting and useful about your book, Gaye Theresa, is that, you know, there's a whole New York-centric history about particularly popular culture of the last 5 years. You know, so we've all, you know, readily accepted a narrative that talks about African American and Afro-Caribbean and Puerto Rican youth in New York in the 1950s and the 60s, and Latin Boogaloo and all this stuff kind of translating to what we understand as hip hop, you know, in the mid-1970s. And what you have unearthed for us is that there's this whole history that's occurring on the left coast that we don't talk about as much, that we don't have a kind of hands-on feeling for what exactly is happening. And you've really kind of shown that going back to the 30s and the 40s, you know, whether it's in figures like Charlotta Bass and Louisa Moreno, that folks are grappling with ways for these two communities to come together. I mean, the book really functions as a counter narrative to what is this official story of this tension that's supposed to be there between Black and brown communities. I mean, what about this research, when you delved into it, really surprised you?
You know, I guess in part surprised me, and in a way, it's about the research, but it's also about these preconceptions that you're talking about. Is that, you know, some of the scholars even that I most admire, whose work I think of as a model, many of them, because a lot of this hasn't been done in some ways. I mean, I think over the past 10 years, we've had more books that have been so useful about the racial and cultural intersections in Los Angeles. But many of them were saying to me things like, you know, you'll find very easily the influence that Blacks have had on Chicanos, but you won't find the influence that Chicanos have had on Blacks.
Right.
And so it's interesting because even some of the most progressive scholars, the people who are, I think, most astute on how congregation and race and culture making works, we're still kind of stuck. I think we just haven't had a lot of theoretical innovation in terms of how to move a little bit outside of the center of what we know, to think differently about these communities, not necessarily even in a comparative sense, but in an interrelational sense. And also, I think so that was surprising to me because you know, I was already finding so much that was contrary to that. But the other thing I think was that once I decided that this writing needed to be part of a larger context of social justice work, that it needed to fit well within a history that's been established by people who, as my colleague George Lipsitz says, make history but don't always make the history books. You know, I was astounded really at how, when I started to think in that way about not so much in the ways that we're trained as academics to think, does this fit, does this work? You know, at a certain point I was able to say, well, you know, it doesn't have to always work. And this is what I think was the most astounding thing for me personally and professionally about writing, is that really the story is never over. And so if we can't end the book, for example, on a note where it says, you know, and then, you know, there came this time in 1996 where Black and brown people realized that they had, you know, so much in common, and now they decided never to fight again. This is not the story. And in fact, in many ways, things are much worse than they've been between these groups. But there's a way that the struggles speak for themselves, that there's a way that there was a message that Luisa Moreno, who wasn't Chicana, but who was somebody who was involved in Black and Chicano struggles in Los Angeles, there's a way that some of these things don't fit easily. But when you think about them in that social justice rubric,
Yeah.
they're a vital part of the story.
Right.
And they give us more hope than.
We're here with Gaye Theresa Johnson, the Associate Professor of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, author of the latest book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Gaye Theresa, and again, so much about this book is about these kind of really interesting terms that you use to describe what's taking place. And one of them I was really struck by is this idea of social citizenship, that of folks redefining community and belonging and citizenship based on these social relationships that they have nothing to do with how the state will define what citizenship is. And so can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, particularly in the shadow of all of these anti-immigration narratives, that we see in the country?
As you were starting to ask that question, I was hoping that's where you were going with it, because I've been really feeling like this is something that needs to be talked about. And, by way of a rather kind of wandering introduction to the answer here, I was driving on Saturday out east of, northeast of Los Angeles, and it was very hot. It was a very hot day, and I'm looking out past the highway, and I'm looking at all of these pickers who are in the fields, and it's 102 degrees out there, and I keep thinking about, every time I pass, because living in California, anytime you're on a highway, just about at some point you're going to pass a crowd of workers in the fields, and so our proximity to this kind of terrible condition of work is always a reminder. But this question about social citizenship came up for me because it occurs to me that the ways that especially Black people have been battered when it comes to this notion of citizenship. I mean, we've got such an incredible history of fighting for the true meaning of the 14th Amendment. And we have struggles that are rooted in that fight that are so admirable and so important and have served as a model for immigrants as they have also struggled for their rights. But one of the things that I think has happened, and which is something we really need to watch, is the way that the condition of undocumented immigrants has served as a marker of Blacks' proximity to whiteness. And I think that Black people now, there's many people who identify some of the common oppressions, right? But in many ways, between Black and brown people, and especially when you think about the treatment of undocumented immigrants who are detained and the general prison industrial complex as a structure and a system that is making so much money off of our bodies. But I think we have to be really careful politically about the ways in which we exploit the condition of undocumented immigrants. And so, that I wanted to just say that real quick. But coming back more specifically to answer your question, I think this notion of establishing a sense of horizontal social membership is something that we don't look at as a concrete site, right, where we have defined who we are. And I think that one of the most incredible pieces of evidence that comes out of that practice is the popular culture that we're so well known for. But because people don't really know how to study and write about it, I think often in a broad scale, I mean, there are people like you, of course, who have done just such incredible work that people learn to think about these things in more concrete and important ways. I think by and large, many of us have suffered from a lack of that kind of exposure of how to talk about these as concrete sites of social membership, where people say, like, this is why I write about war, because war is a group that has such an incredible history. They start out, Senor Sol and Sarapes and Sombreros, these brothers from South LA who grew up listening to mariachi, that somehow it all comes together for them. When I was interviewing once the timbalero for Santana, I said, so, who is your biggest influence on you? And I'm expecting to hear Tito Puente or, Mario Bausa. And he's like, Earth, Wind, and Fire. And I was like, wow, Earth, Wind, and Fire. Okay. Now you grew up in the Mission District in San Francisco, and I'm thinking, now see, this is a place that, I mean, this is something that we need to come to understand is why does this music speak to us so well, and how is it that we can continue to articulate these connections in ways that not only kind of mean something for us academically, but more importantly can galvanize us into understanding the value of that history and the value of that crosstalk, if we may.
We're here with Professor Gaye Theresa Johnson. You're watching Left to Black. We're talking about her latest book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. As much as this book, as you just suggested, is about social justice, it also really is a book about popular music. And growing up in the East Coast, and particularly some of the older kind of what I like to call neo doo-wop groups, the groups that come along late 60s and the 70s. And a lot of them will talk about the fact that, if they're performing now, the audience that they're primarily performing for are brown audiences. And I remember hearing, for instance, Tiara singing Together Baby in the early 1980s and trying to piece together what this history is and what we now, reflect on as kind of brown-eyed soul. Talk about that very interesting relationship of groups like El Chicana. I listen to Viva Torado probably about 3 or 4 times a week, and it's just one of those tracks that I like. But you have people like Patty Drew, who's a black woman R&B singer, but of course she's singing this music that resonates for this audience. What was it about this black R&B, doo-wop sound, that created this interesting kind of intermix, for brown folks, particularly young brown folks in the 60s going forward?
Well, I always think of it as that kind of listenership. It's a very particular listenership.
Yeah,
because,
absolutely.
I mean, even the stuff that's coming from the East Coast, like Joe Batan's Mujer Mia and all of that stuff, even though it's later, it's still based in those same tones and modes, right? And so the doo-wop sound and all of that. And there's something about it that kind of, I think, taught a lot of first generation Latinos how to be in low-income communities that are in the United States. So in a sense, I mean, I feel like that is one of those untold, almost rites of passage to becoming American is Black soul, and in Latino communities. So and it's interesting. I mean, I think we should say more about this in future books. Is that what is it about this sonic pattern that then, I mean, because once you become a fan of that music, once you become someone who's playing it, who's singing it, you are American, and so even if you don't speak English really, but this is you're American, but what about that makes you American, especially at that particular time? And I think that because this is such an important part of our collective memory of Latino communities. I mean, you watch, for example, American Me. I was trying to think of the name of the film. But so much soul in there. There's so much soul and doo-wop in that that film, and it's all about an aesthetic, almost physical rememory of that time. So, I think that there's an appeal that goes back to the ballads that were so important at the turn of the century in Los Angeles, that were being played on the radio, that were Mexican ballads. There's a connection between the romance of that's contained in each. I think there's a longing that's contained in each that's familiar. I think that there's a collectivity in terms of the way that music is produced and the sounds that we hear of collectivity that is familiar, and the melodies. So much of what we hear are in major keys, in those songs, and while many of them are sad or ballady, and kind of low, they're also very much about love and all of the things that we're trying so hard to maintain in very oppressive times. So even if you don't speak English and you're listening to Black soul, there's something about it that speaks to your condition.
Absolutely. And yet, when you go forward into the 1980s and the Reagan era, you see folks coalescing around a different kind of sound, where you're talking about Black and brown, queer folks coming around punk music. And I think about the film Selena, the film version of her life, and Selena's brother Chris. I think it was her brother, who was really this kind of metalhead, and
Yeah.
it seems strange to watch it, you know, in the context in the film. But of course, when you read about this history in your book, it makes so much more sense. So talk a little bit about this punk scene. I know you mentioned earlier in the interview, you know, you weren't expecting to find that. You know, that was not something that you were expecting that you would have to delve into.
No way. You know, it's not an easy genre. If that's what you're not, you know, that's what you're not used to. But I thought, you know, if I could, you know, I hear people sometimes when they listen to folks' demos, they say, well, I got to strip it down and listen to just this part or just this part. And that's kind of what I felt I had to do as I was, because I had to slow it down really and think, okay, there's much more here than screaming. Although we have to take the screaming seriously, though, right? We have to take the screaming seriously because this too is articulation of spatial entitlement.
Right.
It's saying, look, you know, I am asked by all of the things that rule my life right now, including Reaganomics, including, you know, neoliberal, you know, the growing militarization of our communities, and the stripping of the assets that assure collective success. All of those things are rendering my family and community silent, and so somehow, somewhere, I find in the screaming a sonic, not just a release, but a sonic articulation of entitlement, not just to be here, but also to utter these truths. And so when I started looking at this era, and I, of course, the first thing I thought was, oh yeah, I'm going to go straight into talking about rap music because I have experience doing that. It's no problem. But then what became much more interesting to me was the ways so many of the people in the places and the spaces that I was interested in were listening to something different. And maybe they were also listening to rap music, but there was a practice that was about punk. And so when I read Alice Baggs' autobiography, actually quite late in the writing, I was just blown away by the things she was saying, the way that she talked about being in movie theaters in the Dos por Uno nights, where she was looking, you know, and listening to Pedro Infante and saying, you know, these are the people that speak to me. They're actors, they're not, you know, musicians, but they're people who are speaking to the people in the very last seat, and I want to be that person. I want to be the one who speaks to people, and that was how she learned to be a punk musician. And so thinking about two different modes of space in that sense was the spatial entitlement people are articulating through that sonic gritos that we hear even before that in the 60s and the 70s through the music of El Chicano and so many of these other groups that are asserting the right to be in space in South and East LA, but also the declaration of the right to stay in community.
Yeah.
And this was, I feel, in the literature on punk, because I think that the dominant things that have been written about punk have been about youth rebellion. It absolutely is a rebellion against conventions, but it's also a way that I mean, I think punk amongst Latinos and Blacks, but especially Chicanos in California and Chicago is about respecting your community, about singing the things that make sense about it, that are beautiful, that deserve to be looked at, deserve to be honored, and that even talking about one's parents as people that deserve to be honored. This is something that I thought was incredibly remarkable and needed to be said about honoring one's community. So I was really blessed to be able to talk about punk music.
And it's great because, you know, one of the things that particular chapter provides a context for, that when you see, say, Ice-T emerge in the early 90s, you know, with his Cop Killer recording in the band Bounty Body Count, it makes sense, right? It's not an outlier, right? It's actually part of a broader community and tradition that's occurred that he understood the value of tapping into, you know, as a way to kind of expand what he was talking about at the time.
That's right, absolutely, and to be able to set it in context was just, again, an example of how we have to think very differently across time and space about what it is that matters in the interaction, the historical interaction of these groups, because there isn't again, always a comparative rubric. It's often a relational rubric, and it doesn't always make sense in the time that we're used to. But certainly when you, I mean, this is a perfect example. When you set his emergence in that context, it absolutely makes sense. Yeah.
We're here with Gaye Theresa Johnson, who's a professor of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the author of the latest book, Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity, Music, Race, and Spatial Entitlement in Los Angeles. What's next for you, Gaye Theresa? Oh,
lots of amazing, interesting things that are surprising me all the time. I'm doing a new project that is about elevating women of color in film, but and there's more sort of immediate work. I have a contract with Haymarket to do a radical history of women in hip hop, and I thought that this would be important to do because of course, we hear so much about women in hip hop in the academic sphere about misogyny, and there's really no critical history of women graffiti artists and dancers and MCs. And so I'm collecting that now, and it's really more of a conversation starter. It's not meant to be the definitive volume, but I think it's something that is just moving in a different direction, I hope, because so many women are just completely unsung when it comes to the various pillars of hip hop. We hear about light, thank God we hear about light, because light is amazing, and we hear about, all of these women who are MCs, but there's so many women who've been holding it down for years, who are still tagging, who are still, who are still dancers, who are still publishing photography, doing all kinds of stuff. So that's what I'm working on immediately anyway.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Gaye Theresa.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks so much, Mark, for your work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real IG for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, all black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos, all black medallions, yeah. All black, say, all black everything. All black, all black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos, all black medallions, yeah. All black, yo.
We've been talking with Professor Gaye Theresa Johnson, and for those of you who don't know, she is married to the legendary Chuck D, a Public Enemy. How are you doing today, Chuck?
Good. Getting adjusted. I'm good. I'm getting a piece of my head back.
I thought it'd be great to have the two of you on screen, just to kind of do an index of all the stuff that we've been watching over the last couple of months. And I'll start immediately with just watching the celebrations, if that's even the word that we want to use, marking the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. What were your general opinions either of the march that happened that Saturday or then the kind of presidential event that occurred that Wednesday? What do you think those events say about what's happening in Black America, but obviously Black America's relationship to this country?
Personally, I think we're just in a weird space, socially, with technology. It's just like it's a weird space where people are kind of coming to their own assessments based on their like-minded connections. And when you see these things play out in media such as television, like this march, and the marches, you're wondering, like, it's really like a thin line between the dog and pony show.
Yeah.
and where we're at as a people. And I just think that these technologies have just connected so many different types of like-mindedness around the world. When it starts to talking about a certain incident in a particular country, I don't know where that stands. So I'm really kind of like doing more listening and watching from afar for the next maybe year, because we're in a really weird space right now. What's not.
It's funny because, folks sat there and watched their CNN feeds or their MSNBC feeds, and, everything gets framed a certain kind of way depending on what, network you were watching. But I keep going back to the Philip Agnew, 2-minute video from Dream Defenders, and how these young folks, even as they were told we can't be on stage, they knew how to use the technology in a way that cut outside of that. I mean, they didn't need to march. I mean, they did not need those 2 minutes on stage, in front of the Lincoln Memorial. They had a whole nother way in which they could reach those audiences.
Yeah, and you got all these things popping up. Like we did a concert, the Made in America concert, and I wanted to rip the clip off of YouTube and use it as our intro.
Agnews speech.
Agnews speech, yeah.
But YouTube came up with some kind of different technology which didn't allow what I was using to rip. So therefore, I tried to reach out to Philip to actually get it. So it's funny how all these technologies are moving. They're looking to protect their streams. They're looking to publish, keep their publishing to itself. And so therefore, I just want to be able to go and use my technological know-how for the second to go and adapt Agnew's speech. But it was there. But long story short, it's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. It would have been nice, though, to be part of that. But they actually made a subject out of not being part of it that was kind of, riveting. I
mean, which is interesting, right? That it's kind of like how social media is both for and makes it more challenging for the people to be the people. And so here you want to be able to use something like this, and yet it's mediated by something that doesn't allow you to do that.
And yet, ironically, if anybody wanted to watch your full set at Made in America, Chuck, all they have to do is go to YouTube. Hell, I posted it on my blog, right? Just for folks to be able to watch the full set. So it's interesting what kind of things get allowed and what kind of things don't.
Yeah, we're running into real distinct yet different oppositions now. Maybe somebody won't stop you from the feds, but somebody's going to stop you from a corporation that has dominance over everybody's minds and eyes. Mm-hmm. We're in a weird space right now.
For a lot of folks, Chuck, when they found out that Public Enemy was performing at Made in America, it might have raised some eyebrows because they're saying, why would Chuck D and Public Enemy be at quote unquote a Jay-Z festival? But in some ways, right, it makes perfect sense because it's a venue that allows you to reach a larger audience. But talk a little bit about your process in that regard.
Well, last year I refused to play at a Made in America concert. I actually got, I got voted down this year. So I said, if I got voted down, we have to go into Made in America with a different type of agenda. What is it? What is it about? So I actually talked it over with my wife. I talked it over with the crew. And I just said, look, if we're going to go in Made in America, it just can't be that. And Made in America is just an updated version of back in the day Budweiser Super. They got Smokey Robinson and Zapp today. And this is, I had to go into that mindset. And I said, look, if we're going to go into Made in America, we're going to have to revise our position there. So we just immediately said, no. Philadelphia was the first city that embraced Public Enemy. So we're going to go in. This is made in Philadelphia.
Right.
And we're going to go in with a couple of agendas that are necessary to actually make it make sense for us, which I think artists should do. If you're going to play a concert, you should adapt the concert or what a setting, especially we're playing with varied other artists, and adapt that setting to agendas that kind of fit you as opposed to the venue or the I would say the collection of artists. I mean, we play many festivals around the world, and they might have beer, be the main sponsor. Doesn't matter to me when they're in that country. So, I mean, those conversations I had with Gaye early on, and that kind of made us have a clear picture on what we wanted to do with that. And what we did with that concert was rather light, and it came out heavy.
But one thing he's not talking about is some of the money that he earned, he put back into Philadelphia, and into grassroots organizations, and then also the very public ways in which he tried to maintain the focus on Mumia Abu-Jamal and Assad Shakur
in Philadelphia, right?
Philadelphia, because how can you be there and not say that? You know, I mean, and this is the big critique that so many of us have of Jay-Z, and we could this, in perpetuity. But how could you be in Philadelphia and not make this about Mumia Abu-Jamal? How could you? Right. So it was such a beautiful. I mean, it's such a. It's as if you have all of this privilege bestowed upon you on the backs of all of these people who struggled for some different kind of dream. Absolutely. And you dishonor it by not paying attention to the things that still are keeping people out in the most mean and cruel ways. And so here we have, I think, someone who is at the helm of a group that is still willing to take these chances, regardless of whether they get asked back or not, which they probably won't. But then the next week, Chuck received the Paul Robeson Award in Washington, D.C., and Mumia Abu-Jamal called him while he was on stage. Yeah, right. Just like, it's incredible. We had Brother Ali, who we respect very much, is a good friend of ours, here with us on Friday. And one of the things he was reminding me of was the way that, often as a conscious artist, he becomes very frustrated with the amount of reward that goes to people who really have the opposite sort of consciousness. And he's not talking about money or fame. He's really talking about the kind of resources that allow you to take care of your family. And he was telling me a really dynamic and incredible, beautiful story about how he had said this one day to his wife, and his wife, Tiffany Jones, who's an incredible person too, had said, but look at your walls. Look at the people on your walls. Yeah. Those are the people that you admire. So why do you expect anything different? And I feel like that's a story that'll always stay with me because it's such a powerfully astute point. And I think this is the kind of thing that we have to remember. I mean, it's no offense to Jay-Z, but Mumia Abdul-Jamal ain't calling him what he's doing.
Real talk, real talk.
Thank you for what he's doing in terms of the struggle that is still very much a part of who we are.
Chuck, we just had the chance to talk with Gaye Theresa about her amazing book, talking about Black and brown relations in Los Angeles. And I can go on about how much I learned and how much scholars, her peers, learned. What do you learn from Gaye Theresa?
What a great question.
Trying to figure that out every day. Well, my wife pays really close attention to detail. And it allows me to really seriously look at detail with at a different level than I've done before. I've also learned that she has passion and commitment into what she speaks about, what she teaches, and we have passion in our particular business professions, respectively, but her passions are really rooted into what she believes 100%. And I'd like to think the same way. So I learned from her, look, if you're going to be definitely about it, we have to figure out the detail that you have to kind of give and try to be as clear as possible. I think I was clearer in the past. I was. I don't know if it's age, and I don't know if it's just ongoing snowball of confusion that's coming on, because it's you keep up and you're seeing that that these oppositions kind of move around like chess pieces, and so I'm in the mode of listening more. That's another thing I learned from Gaye, is that sit back, and in order for you to learn some detail, you better sit back and just kind of listen and breathe the air and appreciate the real small tiny things. I've always been that person, but to actually have a person actually remind me of it is very rare.
You're watching Left of Black. We've been joined by Professor Gaye Theresa Johnson, Professor of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and we've been joined also by her spouse, the legendary Chuck D of Public Enemy. I want to thank you two both for taking a little bit of time out for our Left of Black audience today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real IG for this one. Yeah.